And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Breaking Thru in B2B. I'm your host, Michael Haynes, SME Advisor. Breaking Thru in B2B's live stream show dedicated to helping SMEs to excel in the world of B2B. So welcome as you come on board to watch and say hello and where you're from. Today, it's a pleasure to welcome back our special guest, Tom Williams from the United States, B2B sales expert, author, consultant, all-around great guy. Tom, thank you very much for being on the show again.
Well, thank you, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to be back with you and your listeners.
Yes, we had a really great show a couple weeks ago where we covered a lot of very interesting and pertinent topics. And thank you for making this a suggestion for us to continue our discussion, because I think as we're coming into 2021 and businesses are getting ready about, what are their plans or roadmaps to move forward, that there's some further areas that I think we really do need to delve into to really help B2B sellers to really position themselves and get ready to really conquer and take things to the next level in 2021 and beyond. So with that being said, Tom, let's get right into it and let's talk about one of the things that, as we've all been hearing about and as you and I talked about in the last show, that, the world of B2B is changing. One of the characteristics of the new norm of B2B, which is really starting even before all of this COVID pandemic craziness, was the increase in the multiple participants in the buying process, and now this buying by committee, which is something that our B2B sellers, particularly those in enterprise, government, corporates, are really going to have to deal with. So let's spend a bit of time talking about that. So Tom, what have you been seeing in the last few months with respect to this buying by committee? From what I've been observing here in this part of the world and in Canada, and also talking to colleagues like yourself, that there's been an increase in the number of committee members. So now it's it's not uncommon to have 8 or 10 people involved. What are some of the things are you seeing in addition to increasing in the number of people involved within the whole buying by committee process?
Yeah, it's interesting, Michael. I think, as you know, buying is changing, and there's more people are getting involved, and oftentimes, the various stakeholders are forming, a buying committee, but not everyone wants to make a change, and everyone is cognizant of the various risks that are inherent in making a change. This makes it really difficult, for change to occur, regardless of the number of potential advantages. So the things that we're seeing is that we're seeing two things. One is there's what I would call an ad hoc, type of committee, which is just a group of people that are coming together to make a decision. And so I might have one person who's got a problem, that they want to solve, or maybe an opportunity they want to capitalize on, a risk they want to mitigate, and they'll look around the organization and say, well, who else needs to be involved in this decision, or who else does this impact? The second type of committee is is where I came out of, where I've got a lot of clients who are in the healthcare space, and there's what I call a formal standing committee. And so that's a committee where it's already determined, the number of people that are going to be involved, their names and their titles. And it's really, you could call them a new products committee, you could call them a value analysis committee, you could call them some other term. But the idea is that it's a formal committee that a group of sales professionals have got to go through in order to sell. And so there's really two different types of committees, and your approach, differs just slightly with depending upon which type of committee that you're working with.
And so, Tom, are you seeing, given where we're at right now and where different industries and companies are at in this whole new norm, is there tending to be a more preference to one over the other in terms of what we're kind of seeing now being in existence within B2B companies?
No, I think the biggest difference is, Michael, it comes down to the larger the organization, the more formal that they tend to be.
Yep.
And you probably have much more of a standing committee with larger companies, whereas the smaller, the mid-sized companies are probably more what I would call ad hoc. And that poses some challenges for the salespeople, because a lot of times, they've never bought before. They've never bought your product or service before. And so there's an inherent amount of risk that's involved with those people, and they don't always work well together. They've got different types of goals and objectives. So it's a much more of a challenge, to work, I think, with those people than a formal committee. Because a formal committee, we can really set down some real guidelines of how to work with those people.
And so with regards to the whole buying committee and trying to create that consensus, facilitating that process, what are some things, there's been a lot of discussion, I'm sure you've seen now, about sales enablement, buyer enablement, providing the right kind of tools, content. So if we talk first in terms of the context of those formal committees that are being formed, as sellers that are looking to try to get into those organizations and to help facilitate that buying by committee process, which according to the latest surveys by McKinsey & Co., B2B buyers are finding it more convoluted and more complex. What are some of the things that they should be doing as part of that buyer enablement in terms of providing the right kinds of insights, the right kinds of information and tools? What are some tips, suggestions with respect to particularly those formal larger committees, which many of our listeners were SMBs trying to get in those larger organizations? What sort of things should they be doing to facilitate that buyer enablement to help that buying by committee and consensus?
Well, let me, if I could, Michael, let me just take a step back first and talk about a little bit about, and then jump into this. What's the problem with committees? And I think the committees are really what I call the mysterious black boxes of the universe. And we wrote about this in our chapter on committees and the seller's challenge. Sellers often assume they understand what's inside that black box, only to find out once they get in there that it's not what they expected. And the word committee is often used to cloak the secrecy of the buying process. So one individual's committee is another team's group, or another team's team or group. And it's important for salespeople to understand all committee members aren't created equal. Information is not always shared. Right. There's different committees that employ different types of decision processes. Not all committee members have the same urgency to surround the buying process. And the easiest decision for a committee, to make is to do nothing. So one of the things to get into, if you're going to try to use buyer enablement or sales enablement to get into there, you've got to somehow change their perception. And you do that with either data or particularly with stories. And so you've got to create some type of situation where you get the buyer to think differently, right? Because if you think about status quo for a minute, there's 3 stages of status quo. There's comfort, curiosity, and then there's concern. And if I'm in comfort, everything is good. I don't want to do anything different, right? There's no reason to even have a conversation unless you somehow provoke me to get me into curiosity, and then from curiosity, get me into concern.
Yeah. So those are some great points that you've raised there, Tom. I've just been making a few notes as we were having the discussion. So it sounds like one of the key things with respect to buying of committees, when you say data and stories, to me, it's almost like, well, perhaps insight. So it could be, is it things like new approaches, what other industries are doing, what other companies have done, case studies to kind of enlighten and perhaps to get folks to that situate that feeling of concern, as you talk about those 3 C's, to get them to want to be moving forward and potentially get things happening. Is that some of the kinds of things that they might be doing?
Yeah, I don't want to go too far into case studies or anything else. What I really want to do is provoke a conversation, right? Yeah. I don't want to give them too much information that would confuse them. But what I do want to do is provoke the curiosity, and so sometimes you can do that with a referral, from another good quality customer. Yeah. Other times it could be from a piece of literature or a piece of data that you saw. It could be from some insight that you have from reading, about their company and some particular problems that they're having. The idea is you've got to do some research to find out where might you find an Achilles heel with that buyer that you can impact in a positive way. And all you're trying to do is create a conversation. Once you get the conversation, then you can start to really walk through their buying process and your sales process.
Got you. Oh, okay. And in terms of the buying by committees, where do you see the notion of the discovery sessions fitting in as part of helping to facilitate that buying by committee, that process? What's your view on how that can be leveraged as a means to progress the buying journey and the whole decision-making process when we're dealing with that buying by committee?
Can you tell me a little bit more, Michael, what you mean by that? I want to be sure I understand exactly where you're coming from.
So in terms of, we've got all these multiple folks on the buying committee that we have to try and be meeting their requirements too. But if it's a new organization and you want to be, trying to really unpack and discover, what it's really going to take to progress the whole buying process and to really get that company. So I'm really talking, I guess, in this sense, a potential new acquisition. Like to know, how does that discovery process, having those discovery sessions where you're unpacking those needs and requirements, et cetera, how that can be used to help facilitate that consensus building amongst those people in that formal buying committee?
Well, I think you do it through a strong discovery process that starts with some research and up front. I think you have to make some type of supposition about what type of problem, opportunity, or threat they may be facing. Provoke a discussion, and then once you get into the discussion, once you have that opportunity to have the discussion, then you can really go in and try to unpack or uncover, what's their current state, where are they today. Where do they see that they would like to be, in the future? What's the root cause of why they haven't solved this particular issue or capitalized on this opportunity or mitigated this risk before? And then if you look at the difference between their current state and their future state, you can define what the cost of inaction is. Once you've done that, then the next question becomes is who else in the organization is impacted, by this, this cost of inaction. And then, the last question, or the next question I like to ask is, what's the organization's priority to actually do something about it? Once you've done that, and you've uncovered the different people who are involved, that pretty much tells you who the committee is.
Yes.
And like I said earlier, in a smaller or mid-sized company, those are probably going to be the people that are going to be forming that ad hoc committee. Whereas in a larger organization, that individual is going to say to you, for us to go and have too much more of a conversation, I've either got to kick this over to procurement and have you brought into the organization under our formal policies and procedures for new products, or I'm gonna send you to put this before our committee, and that's then where the fun really begins from a sales professional point of view, as well as all the angst.
Okay, fantastic. Tom, a question that I tend to get from a number of clients, and I actually had one this week in a meeting I had with a international-based startup going into North America, is the question is often with respect to recognizing when there are multiple decision makers and they're coming, you've got people involved from risk, from finance, from technology. What's the first entry point? So you're going after a new, prospect. Any suggestions as to how you can go about, again, in terms of identifying, because I know we talked about in our previous discussion with respect to those discovery sessions, having it, you were saying, with initial one or two people. Any suggestions in terms of how to identify who those initial one or two people be for those initial meetings, when there could be potentially people from a number of different departments, functional groups that could be on that committee? Any suggestions as to that first step in terms of making that first outreach for that first meeting, in terms of who to identify to have that initial discussion with?
Sure. I think there's a couple things. First and foremost is I think you have to find out from the organization, look at the organization you're going after, and find out if they have any formal procurement policies and procedures that a sales representative must follow. Because what I'm finding is more and more larger organizations and many healthcare organizations in the United States, you must start with procurement. And if you don't start with procurement, and procurement finds out that you went to someone else, another buying influence or stakeholder in the organization, they will blackball you and eliminate you from being considered as a vendor. Not only you as an individual, but the company in which you represent. So I think you have to find out, other formal policies and procedures around how the organization you're going to sell to, wants you to have access. Assuming that there are no policies and procedures, or assuming that, we're not in a COVID area where you've got people going to trade shows and things, you can meet a lot of company personnel at a trade show, and you can establish a relationship with them. And even if there is a policy where you have to come in through procurement, they can bring you in. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it, but I think you have to do some investigation and some research to make sure you don't get yourself in a situation where you inadvertently get blackballed. Procurement is often looked at, as the enemy. And I know for a lot of your listeners, they probably are the enemy. But I can tell you that there's a growing trend, especially in large organizations, toward working more closely with procurement. And procurement is getting a seat at the C-suite table, and they're becoming more and more valuable, to the CEO. And so the strategy in the past has always been to avoid procurement. And I would be the first one to tell your listeners, if you can take an order and receive an order and get an order without going through procurement, where all they have to do is just process the PO, by all means do it. But if you are forced to go through procurement, then you have to thinking about looking at procurement as an ally, not as an enemy. Because if you think of them as an enemy, it's going to come through in the way in your approach, and you're immediately going to be seen, in a negative way. And all of a sudden, you've got an adversarial relationship where what you need to do is build a more positive relationship. They're not going away; they're going to increase in power, and it's incumbent upon sellers to recognize that and to learn to work with them.
Okay. Tom, I'd like to probe on that just a little bit further. So if we've got a scenario where, yes, it's a big organization, you've got to go through procurement, and they've got their rigid, procedures that you have to go through. But you're well aware, though, from your research that there are other key people within the organization that you need to be speaking to. Let's say if we're talking technology solution, there's people within the technology department and let's say an operation. So then do we try to liaise and engage with those folks within procurement with a view to hopefully getting some exposure and interaction with those other key stakeholders that are really going to have some heavy pull in the final decision? Just if you could shed some light or any suggestions on how that might work.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of things you can do, Michael. I mean, one is you can help the buyer to buy, right? As I said earlier, oftentimes, the folks in which we're trying to sell products to have never bought your product or service before, so they really don't know the right thing to do. In other cases, and in some cases, like where procurement is calling you and asking you to come in and give a price quote or provide some information, whatever it happens to be. They're working with an internal stakeholder. They're dealing with someone who's got a problem that they want fixed. And, they're asking procurement to help you. So in some cases, procurement's already going to have a list of people that you're going to want to interface with, or they're going to want you to interface with once you've had an initial conversation with them, and they've screened you and approved you to have those conversations. In other cases, as the seller, you're going to have a pretty good idea of the people that your product or service touches, and that ought to be involved in the decision-making process for your product or service. And in that case, it's incumbent upon you to be transparent and say to purchasing, hey, I don't know if you've ever bought this product or service before, but I make a living doing this. And in our experience, these are the types of people within a typical organization that would need to be involved, are any of these titles, similar in your organization? And is there anyone else that you'd like to have involved? And then cover what those people are, because they're going to be involved sooner or later anyway. And so, find out quickly, and as opposed to later in the sales cycle.
Okay, that's a really great tip, Tom. So it's really about you as a seller being proactive in those situations and making them aware of who is going to be involved, who's going to be in their best interest from an implementation execution perspective to get those people involved as part of the process.
Michael, from my perspective, it's all about as being buyer-centric. And that to me means help the buyer buy, co-create a solution that meets their needs, that provides to them the outcomes that they desire, and gives them it helps them solve whatever problem it is that they're working for. They need to get those outcomes. So be transparent and be honest and help them buy. Yeah. As opposed to working your sales process, I got to do 20 questions here and I got to do this. Push that aside. I mean, there's certain elements of that are important, but what we really got to do if we're going to be buyer centric is put your shoes think of yourself in the shoes of the buyer and help the buyer buy.
Yes, and that's a great. I think that's a great tip that you've really brought forth today, Tom. Is about helping the buyer buy and really viewing procurement as the ally to help you help buyers buy and achieve what they want to achieve, as opposed to viewing them as some sort of enemy and impediment on doing so. So I think that's a very different perspective and important perspective that sellers need to have. So thank you for that. Tom, so I'd like to move us on to risk, because risk is another big issue. It's top of mind of every decision maker right now who pretty much wants to mitigate risk. And so first, I'd like to have a bit of a chat from your perspective. What are you seeing in terms of, like, in your book? And folks, you must get Buyers Centered Selling, fantastic book. But in your book, Tom, you detail a lot around the different kinds of risks that are prevalent amongst B2B buyers. From what I'm seeing right now is a lot of it around the financial risk and execution risk seem to be two that seem to be really top of mind with some of the organizations, professional services, tech companies, so forth, that I've been seeing here in Australia and Canada. What are you seeing in terms of the kinds of risks that are prevalent? Are there any ones that are kind of prevalent right now that you've been seeing that are kind of top of mind more than others right now in terms of where we're at here in November and in the midst of all of this crisis and folks trying to get ready for 2021?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Michael, and thanks for promoting the book, because risk is a real hot topic, for me, and it really strikes a nerve, because if you think about it, risk is really the chance that something can go wrong. And what sellers need to do is to keep in mind is the first thing is that they got to do is acknowledge that risk exists for every buyer when they're going to make a purchase that they've never made before, or is from a new vendor that they've never worked with before. And we don't and risk is not taught in any of the sales methodology programs that I'm aware of. So if you want to be buyer-centric seller, you've got to assist the stakeholders in crafting a plan that minimizes the risk, because without that, the buyer is going to become paralyzed and they're going to stay in status quo. Now, there's really 12 different types of risks that buyers can go through. One is, and I hit a couple of the top ones that I think that are important that I think we're seeing today in the COVID area. One is financial. It's money's tight, and so the buyer is always looking at what's the return on investment, what's the net present value, internal rate of return, whatever financial metric that they want to use to make sure that they're making a good, sound financial decision. Second thing is oftentimes unfamiliarity. That it's the first time they've bought from you or they've bought this particular product, and nobody wants to make an ill-informed, or bad decision.
Yeah.
Resource allocation is another big one. Is okay. How many people are going to need to be involved in the implementation? How many people are going to be involved in the decision? How much time is that going to take? Performance is always an issue, right? The provider or the supplier of the product, can they actually provide the quality of the product that I need? So they're going to be looking at product failures. They're going to be looking at product recalls. They're going to be thinking about, early obsolescence, on-time delivery. They're going to be looking at, back orders, those types of things. And then, at the other side of it is procurement always looks at dependency. Are you going to be a primary vendor or a primary or a secondary vendor? They don't tend to want to put all of their eggs in one basket. So they want to go and maybe give you a percentage of the business and give somebody else the percentage of the business so that they can keep both of you a little bit at arm's length, keep both of you wanting to provide a good quality product. Because you both want to get more market share or more wallet share from that particular entity. I think those are probably the ones that are the most prevalent today.
Yeah. And so, Tom, any particular guidelines you'd suggest in terms of how to address some of those risks, such as unfamiliarity risk, for example, resource allocation risk, which might be some of the ones which are quite prevalent, but I think many B2B sellers really, it may not be top of mind, something that they've come across, even when selling complex organizations as to how to effectively address any tips on how to deal with some of those risks that you just talked about?
Yeah, the two things, Michael, that we do routinely in our business and have done for several years. One is I think we may have covered a little bit on it at our last call. We use a mutual action plan, which is really a plan, between the buying and selling organizations, to jointly explore, the feasibility and benefits of working, together in some type of partnership. It's really a sharing of concerns. It's a sharing of ideas, capabilities, obstacles, and what are the risks that we might have in working together. And when we define that type of stuff up front, then that's kind of the beginning of the relationship of understanding what potential risk might be there, at least from one stakeholder. Then when we go and identify all the other stakeholders, we can now go and understand and begin to explore which of those risks are important to each of them. And once we do that, we can start to categorize the risk as being, low, medium, or high from their perspective, not from ours, right? Because it doesn't matter what we think. It's what matters to them. Once we do that, now you can engage what I call the pockets of resistance, and you can be in each of you can be very transparent. You can talk about why the risk is so important to them, and you can talk about acknowledge the fact that yes, it is important. We've seen it with other customers. Here's some ideas of how to overcome it. And then it's just a matter of very frequent open communication. And then what I call building change coalitions. We spend a lot of time talking about building consensus. And there's different parts of the sales buying process where it's important to build consensus, and certainly around risk is one of them.
Okay, fantastic. And so with regard to that process, Tom, so developing that mutual action plan, just to kind of delve in a little bit further into this a bit more detail for folks, because I think this is something that's very, it's crucial, quite important, but I think it's not an approach many sellers take. So so that's happening fairly early from that first or second meeting with that customer, that potential prospect, in terms of starting to work out some of the initial framework of that mutual action plan with a first individual, and then subsequent meetings bring more people involved. Is that sort of how it works?
Yeah, there's a couple schools of thought, and if you look at some of the published literature on the topic, and there's not a lot, but if you look at some of it, there's two schools of thought. One is to do the collaboration plan, or what we call a mutual action plan. Either term works. Some people call it a mutual success plan. It's really, to me, in the beginning, you start it once you've uncovered that there's an opportunity that you think that you can go and help the customer achieve, right? In other words, you've talked to at least one stakeholder. You found out that individual does want to make a change, and you've got a potential solution, that will help them. At that point, I think you introduce the mutual action plan, as opposed to at the very end, which is the other school of thought. Do it at the very end as a closing document. I prefer to use it up front because number one is it positions you as a seller much differently in the eyes of the buyer. When you say to them, look, if you've never bought before, and it's something like this, Michael, I know that you never bought this. Have you ever bought this before? This type of product or service before? And you say no. And you walk in and you say to them, we do this for a living, and would it be useful to you if I outlined to you, the type of steps that typically the buyers that we engage with go through in order to make an informed, intelligent decision. Then once I do that, we'll modify that according to how you guys, what's your policies and procedures and way in which you buy. When we do that, I've never once had an individual say to me, no, I don't think that'd be useful. No, I don't want to do that. So the first thing it does is it's a helpful document to them. The second thing it does is it differentiates you as a seller up front, that you're not like everybody else going to come in and ask 120, discovery questions. The second thing is if I then go and tell them we'll modify this to meet your needs, and what we'll do, we'll build in some milestones, and we'll add, and so then it becomes natural then for them to tell me who are the other people who are going to be involved, that we're going to need to talk to in order to walk through the milestones. It eliminates ghosting, right? Where where people just stop talking to you because if we establish milestones, we establish due dates and responsibilities, right? So it does a lot. It has a lot of advantages to it. And then from that, you can then develop a risk mitigation plan. If risk is a major concern as part of one of those milestones, you can then develop a plan that's between you and the seller, right? The seller and the buyer together.
That makes a lot of sense, Tom. And I think in this environment, really, your approach, that proactive approach, sooner rather than later, I think is quite critical because there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of what's happening in the future, and and buyers, senior leaders are looking for that decision confidence as to what to do, and giving them a roadmap as to how to navigate and mitigating risk. I think that is just. I think it's a must-have now. It's non-negotiable. I think, particularly in this environment, to really bring that up front earlier in the sales process as opposed to later. So that's fantastic.
It helps, Michael. It helps the seller be a facilitator and be totally positioned in a different way. I'm real big on giving people taking and co-creating documents together. Showing customers how to build consensus, doing things that instead of a standard PowerPoint, presentation, sitting down and co-creating solutions, on a whiteboard, or on a piece of paper, that positions you in a different way than a typical sales rep.
Absolutely. And I think that's absolutely the way that collaboration, that co-creation really needs to be, again, given the volatility, the uncertainty, and decision makers need for that kind of confidence and direction. That's definitely a way that needs to be taken to move forward. So Tom, I'd just like to know, with respect to, so we've talked about what to do in the situation of new logos, going for new customer acquisition. What about, are there any, in terms of this approach, are there any nuances or any call outs with respect to if you've got an existing client? Because, they always say when you're looking to grow and expand, start with who you have. Are there any particular considerations, approaches, watch out when you want to start engaging your current customers to get them to maybe, renew, cross-sell, upsell in their benefit? Any suggestions in that scenario when you're dealing with an existing customer, but you're trying to expand that to move forward?
Yeah, great question, Michael. I'll make a couple of comments on it. Let me start with the renewal. The renewal process starts with how your engagement with to win the first sale, and what that handoff looks like. That's becomes the beginning of the renewal process. If that's sloppy, if that's not done well, then the initial mindset for renewal isn't very strong. The second part of the renewal is are you really helping them achieve the ROI or whatever business outcomes that they decided they for the reasons they bought in the first place? So in other words, do you just sell the outcomes? Yeah, we can do that for you, Michael, but do you help them get the outcomes? Mm-hmm. And if you help them achieve the outcomes, it's easy then to get a renewal because you've delivered on what they bought in the first place. If what they bought in the first place, they don't get a return on that investment. If they don't get that business outcome, whatever it happens to be, however they want to measure it, then the renewal is at risk. I think the second part of it is that when you look at cross-selling, it's important to do what we call a white space diagram. And again, we cover that in one of the two books where we talk about it, in terms of cross-selling. There's a whole chapter on cross-selling. And we talk about, how to create a white space diagram. And just, and the importance of that from a selling point of view is that you take and plot all of your customers on one axis, and then you plot the products or services that you could provide to them on the opposite axis. And then you simply X in, if you will, which products you're selling to which customers. And then, we call that, maybe put an X in there in that box. And then we put a Y in if the customer is buying a competitive product and it's under contract, and maybe that contract is for 2 years or 3 years, which means you can't sell that particular product or service to that customer until that contract comes up. And so then it's a question of how do you position yourself to take that business away from that competitor, before it's up their contract is up for renewal. So you've got to start to figure out what point do I need to start that process and do it well in advance of before that renewal is due or a contract is up for renewal. And then the third part of it is to look at what's the white space, what's left where there's a potential, and I can't emphasize that enough. There's a potential opportunity to sell your product there, but then you've got to figure out, who do you have to talk to in the organization to potentially see if there's a need there? Because just because that you've got a white space doesn't mean that the customer has a need for that particular product.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks for that, Tom. Yeah, very valuable practical approaches there, which would be very useful for our listeners. So, Tom, in our remaining time that we have, I'd like to talk a little bit about further in terms of respect to status quo. You and I were having a bit of a discussion about that offline before the broadcast. We'd like to get any kind of tips and perspectives that you have with respect to how to deal with status quo, because it's something that, as you've already alluded to already with some of your previous comments, decision makers, that's going to be their default. If they're feeling any kind of risk, hesitation, well, let's just keep what we're doing now. So any, one or two key tips that you have with respect to, and let's talk in the context of new customer acquisitions, those new logos, anything in terms of you have as some key must-dos, watch outs, which could be reiterating some of your previous points or other considerations in a new logo context. And then similarly, if you've got any one or two key tips for folks with existing customers in terms of them trying to move things forward to unravel, disrupt the status quo to drive revenue and drive growth for that B2B seller.
Yeah, I think, the status quo is always the 300-pound gorilla, I think, for all of us in sales, is that it's the easiest position for the buyer to stay in. It's familiar. It's a familiar area, right? They may not have the best solution. They may acknowledge to you, say, we don't have the best solution. We are having some problems, but it's not a solution they absolutely positively have to do something about today. In other words, it's good is good enough is what I hear quite a bit. Right. I don't need the best, good is good enough. The devil I know is better than the devil I don't know. So that's what we have to overcome. And the only way I think one of the ways to overcome that is to do some basic research and find out, what are they using? Can you do any type of discovery process in advance to find out what some of the problems are that they're exhibiting with, they're having, and then create some type of story or some type of introduction, that will resonate with them. And, if you can do that, then you can create, take them from comfort to curiosity to concern. We gave an example in the book about a young gal that, was trying to call she was representing a pest control company, and she was trying to call on a CEO, and he was satisfied with the pest control company that he had. And he brought his dog to work every day. And the only day he couldn't bring his dog to work was the day that the pest company came in and sprayed, because the spray they used was not pet friendly, and it would go and cause his dog to get violently sick. So one day he came to work and forgot that the pest company was coming in. He had to turn around and take the dog home. Well, the dog is kind of a universal animal that walks around the entire building, and all the employees love to pet him and play with him, etc. And he's like the company dog, and they miss him when he's not there. Well, this gal found out about this, and ironically, her company came out with a new component, a product that was pest free and would not cause any problems. And so she wrote a nice email to the CEO. She also could have left it on a voicemail, and we gave an example of both of those in the books of how she created interest with that individual, and made him aware of a problem that he didn't even know existed, but it resonated with him because he had just taken that dog home. How she found out about it was because she was selling other products into the company, and one of the other stakeholders, one of her customers, told her about this problem. So she was able to create a story around it, and she took all the business away from her competitor. So there's a lot of different ways that we can go about it, but you know, we have to do some research, and we have to be willing to put the time in, you know, to either write a very specific type of poignant email, or you know, share a story that would be very memorable.
Great, fantastic. So once again, really important, really pointing out the importance of having that, doing that listening, having that depth of understanding to bring that story, that perspective, that insight to start the conversation and kind of to get the ball rolling on the buyer's journey. Fantastic. Well, Tom, thank you very much for yet again another very insightful and informative discussion. Been an absolute pleasure, folks. Hope you enjoyed listening to Tom. And again, he's got 2 books, The Seller's Challenge, as well as Buyer-Centered Selling. Both of those are available on Amazon.com or your favorite bookstore. And great insights to help you really to be moving forward, giving you insight and some real practical guidance from both a buyer and seller perspective. So do yourselves, your companies a favor and get a copy of both of those books. For additional insights, you can also go onto my website, listeninnovategrow.com. There's videos, articles, blogs there, tools, etc., to further help you on your B2B journey. Thank you again, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And until next time, take care, stay safe, and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.